Happy International Workers' Day, comrades. May 1st, since the late 1800s, has been traditionally the day that communists and socialists worldwide celebrate collectivism. So, in honor of this day, Carl has asked that we just take a moment and play the Soviet national anthem. It's in English, so we can.
United forever in friendship and labor, our mighty republics will ever endure. The great Soviet Union will live through the ages, the dream of a people, their fortress secure. Long live our Soviet motherland.
We'll put Karl Marx in the dustbin of history where he belongs. So your reading assignment for Monday is pages 422 to 432. And so let's get back to our regularly scheduled discussion of free market economics. So quick follow-up on Tuesday's test. The first question, you had to form a bank and then discuss fractional reserve banking and your relationship to the Fed and the FDIC. So you had to name your bank. So what I want to do is see if you can associate these bank names with your fellow classmates. I'm not going to give you the answers, but you'll probably be able to solve some of them. Okay, first bank, Sowellian Bank of America. Highly approved. Bleak Outlook Bank, or Bob, Bleak Outlook Bank. Very interesting name. The next bank is called Interesting Bank. I think is really an interesting idea. Sunny Gold Company, Bank of Progress, Paradise Banks, and finally, one I really like, the Bank of Common Sense, which every bank should be that, right? Okay, so yesterday we looked at what a government should do in a free market economy, and we learned that the most basic function is provide law and order, enforce contracts, ensure property rights, set standards, what's a mile, what's a pound, provide safety, and importantly, national defense. And we see a lot of that in the preamble to the Constitution. But how does law and order accommodate economic activity? Well, we learned that a reliable framework of laws translates into economic prosperity, and then the opposite is true as well. And we looked at how high levels of corruption are associated with lower growth and lower per capita income. And why is that? Well, corruption by its nature is an inefficient use of scarce resources that have alternative uses. The money that goes into a bribe does not go into producing wealth. It does not go into expanding a business or hiring an employee or building a home. And what is corruption? We learned from Transparency International that corruption is abuse of entrusted power for private gain. And we talked about several types of corruption. Bribes, nepotism, which is hiring family and friends, crony capitalism, which is we see in Russia and communist China, where only friends of the Communist Party or friends of Putin are allowed to be successful, and pay-to-play political donations. Be sure you know what each of those is and have an example at hand. We also looked at the least and most corrupt nations, and the correlation between corruption and prosperity is stark. So we looked at the most corrupt and the least corrupt. And the question is, would you invest your hard-earned capital in Somalia or New Zealand? Well, I think the answer is pretty obvious. Then we looked at a framework of laws, and we saw that laws must be reliable, must not change, depends on who's in power, or be subject to loose interpretation. And that is one of the reasons the U.S. is so prosperous, is that we have such a framework of laws. But we must be ever vigilant. Do the wealthy and powerful escape prosecution in the United States? Do law enforcers selectively enforce the law or break the law themselves? And my challenge to you is look at the news this week and see if you see any hints of something along those lines. Okay, well, foremost among the laws is the property rights for economic prosperity. And as we learned from reading the Communist Manifesto, private property is anathema to collectivism. one of the first things Marx would do was abolish private property, among all the family and all the other things they would abolish. Milton Friedman says, you cannot have a free society without private property. I read a book called Noblest Pursuit, and it is a thesis about the relationship between private property and economic prosperity, how they are intertwined, and also about how the assault on private property, starting with Karl Marx, continues to this day, particularly in academia. I just want to read a few excerpts from that. Over 100 years ago, the institution of private property fell into intellectual disrepute. This is a great historical fact that we must face at the outset. Property's fall from grace was gradual, beginning early in the 19th century, but with the Communist Manifesto, the war on property became overt and finally became respectable. Property in the abstract was then viewed disparagingly by Western intellectuals for many decades. The form that this most commonly took was neglect. Then he goes on to talk about how when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, he really didn't even talk about the fact that private property would ever be under assault. It was always accepted as a common philosophy that we would have private property and it would be sacred. So the English economists didn't spend any time on that, and then Marx came along. Okay, continuing. But there are four great blessings that cannot easily be realized in a society that lacks the secure, decentralized private ownerships of goods. These are liberty, justice, peace, and prosperity. The argument of this book is that private property is a necessary condition for each of these highly desirable social outcomes. Of course, the relationship between liberty and property is by now fairly well understood. Leon Trotsky, famous communist, long ago pointed out that where there is no private ownership, individuals can be bent to the will of the state under threat of starvation. So let's talk about private property. So Dr. S contends that private property is very interesting in that the benefits of strong private property rights even extend to those with little property. And that's because private property leads us to efficient use of scarce resources that have alternative uses. He gives the example of food in the Soviet Union, how when American farmers went to the Soviet Union, they were shocked at how casually the Soviets would just despoil their crops, because nobody owned those crops. They belonged to everybody. They belonged to the people. And so they would just put the bad produce in with the good produce, which would lead to more spoiled produce, because nobody owned the property. So Dr. Soul tells us that property rights are self-monitoring, and anybody who's worked in a restaurant will see that the owner of that restaurant keeps an iron fist over everything that goes on in that restaurant. Make sure the food is not spoiled. Make sure that every salad that goes out to a customer is as best as it can be, because they will benefit from the return that food gets when people buy it. So property rights create self-monitoring, which is more effective than hiring third-party monitors that we see in Cuba and Venezuela and in the Soviet Union. And there is a lot of corruption in societies with weak property rights, and that's again because of the monitoring factor. Private property, people monitor it themselves. Collective property are monitored by third parties who just don't have the incentives to take the same care that the private owners do. One of my favorite expressions in this section, it comes right from Dr. Soul. The only animals threatened with extinction are animals not owned by anybody. Colonel Sanders is not about to let chickens become extinct. What is he saying? I don't quite get that. So what I'd like to do is talk about animals, and one of the more famous animals, and this is Cecil the lion. There's Cecil right there. And Cecil met his demise in 2015. But there is an economics lesson in the death of Cecil. So let's just talk about this a little bit. Well, Cecil was a South African lion, and he would roam across the border into Zimbabwe, and he was a major attraction at a national park. and he was studied and followed by researchers at Oxford University. He was wired up so they could track him and keep and follow him. And school children would talk about Cecil. Well, Cecil was shot by a hunter from Minnesota named Walter Palmer. And Walter was a big game hunter. He loved to hunt. And he was a dentist from Minnesota. And so he tracked Cecil, and he paid $50,000 to a guide to be able to hunt a lion. That's what big game hunters do. They like to hunt rare animals. Honestly, I don't understand trophy hunting. I understand hunting for meat. I understand that well. I'm a Second Amendment person, but I don't understand trophy hunting. But there is a lesson here about private property. So let's continue. After Cecil died, there was an international uproar about the death of this lion because this lion was a celebrity. The people for the ethical treatment of animals actually called for Dr. Palmer to be hung. It was a capital offense, killing this lion. He was ruined. His business went out of business. Nobody would come to him. He was picketed at his home. His life was basically destroyed. Here's what South African President Jacob Zuma said. What it sounded like from a distance is that the hunter did not know that Cecil was so popular. He just saw a lion and killed a lion. And it's Cecil, and Cecil is very well loved. And I think it caused a problem because everyone wants to go and see Cecil. But I think it's just an incident. In Zimbabwe's Minister of Tourism said, the West seems more concerned with the welfare of a lion in Zimbabwe than of Africans themselves. In Africa, a human being is more important than an animal. I don't know about the Western world. Well, the debate centered on this. What is the ethics of big game hunting, of hunting these rare endangered animals? And what is the economics lesson we can get out of it? It is this: trophy hunting, which is the hunting of rare animals. Maybe it's a rhino or an elephant or a lion, which I don't understand. I'll be honest with you. But is this evil, or does it actually lead to the preservation of that species and help ensure that species? Well, the answer to that question is yes. The killing of Cecil, while unfortunate, points to the fact that trophy hunting is preserving these endangered species. And we have to dig into this to see why that is. There's an economic incentive involved. So if we go into South Africa, we see that there's 70,000 people who work in South Africa on big game hunting. Now that's a big number. And this is how it works, is that people have tremendously large farms, 20, 30, 40,000 acre farms. And they let these wild animals come onto this property and propagate and grow more wild animals. And what they do is they protect these wild animals. They have armed guards who guard the perimeter, so there is no poaching. When we look at the national parks in places like Zimbabwe and South Africa, where nobody owns the animals, poaching is rampant. They kill the rhinos and take the horns and sell the powder in China. But when people privately own those animals, they protect them, and poaching is virtually non-existent. Okay? So the country with the best track record for protecting the white rhino, for example, is South Africa, where 16,000 of the 20,000 white rhinos live. And that's because South Africa allows farmers to own the wild animals on their property. And then they sell licenses to people like Dr. Palmer, who go hunt them for $50,000. So the system works. The private property, the animals, are actually preserved. Colonel Sanders won't let chickens go out of business. The rhino hunters, the rhino hunting firms will not let rhinos go out of business because that is their livelihood. So the incentive for private property, even though we love Cecil, we wish he hadn't strayed into private property, but we understand how this works, the incentives for private property. Well, seemingly it doesn't make sense. Killing lions actually leads to more lions being preserved because of the blessings of private property. And without these farms and ranches where the wild animals run free and then are hunted on a selective basis, there would be far fewer of these endangered species. So property rights are incentives. I work harder, I get to keep the fruits of my labor, whether my labor is growing onions, flipping hamburgers, or raising lions so people can hunt them. And this in turn incents me to hunt harder, to work harder, maybe to hunt harder, to get a better job, start my own business, and to get more training to advance. Okay, so that's the story of Cecil the Lion, and you'll read more about private property in your reading today. Okay, talk to you soon.